drops in. Um, Again, welcome. This is a strange panel with three very different papers, I think. But we'll make the best of it. I'm sure we'll have something in common to talk about as the papers develop and as they unfold. I wondered if Mark, if you would like to kick things off for us, and then
Sure.
Tim, and then I'll finish. And I didn't ask for bios. I'm not sure if that was the right thing to do for ACTC, but if you wouldn't mind, just saying a few things about who you are, what your background is, what you're currently doing and working on.
Yeah, sure. So myself and Richard are humanities teachers, I suppose. I teach ethics and philosophy. Richard teaches English and ethics in a East London secondary school, high school, you would say. We've done some work with ACTC before, and I've been to a few conferences. And we attended the Carthage College seminar that ACTC ran 2 years ago. And one of the expectations was that we would come back and do some work on liberal arts with the school. Obviously, COVID got in the way and a lot of other things. And the result is I'm going to take a look at teaching during this period because I was forced to basically respond to it. It's kind of not what I was expecting to present. I was due to present last year at ACTC on a paper on Aristotle, but I've completely abandoned that, although there is some Aristotle in what I refer to. And I decided I had to confront what it meant to be a teacher in these times. So some of what I say, I think, will be not the same as what I've heard this week, but I offer it as a kind of interpretation for responses and see where we get to. It's great to see you all and meet you all, and look forward to a good conversation. So my aim in teaching, our students are 11 to 18 years old. And we're just growing what's called the sixth form, the pre-university age, 16 to 18. We've got a very small sixth form, but it grew significantly last year. And my paper starts lower down the school with the younger age groups, but ends a bit more with the older students, perhaps because we were more able to apply some of the liberal arts ideas to them. So I was trying to teach core texts, Magna Carta, and the US Constitution. It was not part of a curriculum, but it was something that myself and Richard decided we needed to do to get our students to be more aware of what the university expectations would be in what we would agree should be termed liberal arts of some kind. During the process, once COVID happened, I was forced to kind of discover student vulnerability and student visibility. And I then felt overall that the power of the teacher had dissolved. And particularly at the start, when it was not clear to me that the students were actually there, hence my name for this paper is The Invisible Man, but that means the teacher, not the student. So I'm trying to outline how I dealt with this. Okay, so I offer the paper then as a reflection, stress that again. In my work prior to this paper on Aristotle, I had come across the work words of Aristotle in the Posterior Analytics. The things we seek are equal in number to those we understand. We seek four things: the fact, the reason why, if something is, and what something is. To me, these are really powerful, valiant words that any teacher could refer to if they wanted to make a demand on the teacher that they knew more than they knew at the start. I am aware, having been here this week, and it's the same in England, it's not conventional to present the power of the teacher in that way at the moment, but I don't know how you would respond to that. It's more normal, I think, to suggest things like trauma pedagogy or support for the students. These were not my approaches, but I'm not ruling anything out. I'm just saying this is how I dealt with it. So at the start of the pandemic, the words of Aristotle were useless to me. They were just a quote. And the only way I could develop what I was trying to do was to use analogy rather than Aristotle's kind of very succinct summary. So by using analogy, I would try and engage the students who were in front of me, as you all are today, but I can see you and I couldn't see them because they had blank screens. I would talk about the cave in the Republic or Dante's Inferno to kind of see if I could get some kind of engagement, but many of the students just remained silent or invisible. And this is at all ages. I define this to myself as some kind of crisis of the teacher in a Socratic sense. And I felt that the Locke's tabula rasa was a very good summary of the situation of what I was facing, if you like, for myself, as well as I'd normally applied the Locke's tabula rasa to the student mind. I realized it applied to myself. Now, colleagues in school did not necessarily agree with me, and I did not necessarily articulate what I'm saying now because we were so busy trying to engage with what online learning was and so, as some kind of concept or big idea. But these were kind of my personal feelings at that moment. So when students didn't respond, the chat function would be used, as it occurs all the time now. And sometimes students did respond on chat, but some students pretended to be the head teacher or signed in as Boris Johnson, the Prime Minister, and they tried all sorts of very creative tricks, which are very amusing. But these panicked our teachers, and it was often very hard to get through that situation in terms of who had the authority, you know, who was powerful. And the students were much better at the online work, as it were, of showing who was boss than the teachers were. Over time, this situation improved and it calmed down. But what I felt that was that the students were running the lessons. The teachers were disempowered, they lacked confidence, and they were kind of trying to learn from the invisibility of the students, as I said, meaning that they themselves were invisible. I think now that the teachers should have confronted the students more directly. But in fact, the teachers withdrew, and I believe that they institutionally mystified what was happening. They started to theorize online learning, and they turned it into a dogma, and it became something that was above being itself, a bit like Plotinus and the One. For me, this is a crisis of the teacher, but I didn't realize it was self-inflicted. At the school level, as well as online learning, we then came up with the concept of blended learning. I don't know if I think you probably have this in the States, but to me, I simply cannot understand what it means. But it appears to be some sort of mix. Maybe you call it pluralism, but to me, it's avoiding the job. But I'm in a minority, as I've said. We then had other questions. Should we insist that screens were on or off? How much school broadband did we have? How much data broadband did the students have? And could we examine or assess the students? So in fact, we did a good job of assessing the students in the end, but at a much lower level than we normally would have done. So I felt overall that intellectual content was replaced by pedagogical context in the teacher response to the students. And this meant that the invisible men and women multiplied. And therefore, any students that were not present would be themselves multiplied into a new species, the unteachable. And now I call it the unteachable, but I think what people were saying was they're vulnerable, they need support. I'm not trying to minimize or downplay that, but I am trying to confront what I call the normal teacher-student relationship and a kind of hunger for knowledge that I believe is always there. Further discussion followed. We discussed whether we should form an expert group, which we did, but that meant that teachers withdrew even further from the students to talk amongst themselves, a bit like we are now, to try and understand what was going on. And we consistently focused on the nature of the student and their vulnerabilities. Could we engage them? Did they need support? Were they awake, etc. Now, by the time of the summer 2020, we were told in England that essentially we could wind down, but we did need to examine our students. and that you may know there was a big debate in England about how to do this with an algorithm, some kind of mathematical process, or whether we could talk to them. We found that talking to the students was a stroke of genius, because it meant that we talked to them individually for the first time in months, and it became what I would call a modern version of the medieval Quod Libet, a free discussion with the student, and they did not opt out. Every single one turned up. So I felt that it was moving the process forward and getting us back to what we were trying to do as teachers. And I think it gave us confidence, actually, that the students were actually there all along. And it kind of told me that the discussions we were having about what was going on were not quite right, and the students did just want us to teach them. Now, this started me to think, well, what is a teacher? Bear in mind, in the UK, I don't know if it's the same in the States, there's a lot of discussions about teaching and learning. They are autonomized processes. They take away the proper noun, the teacher. And again, this is what was confronting me. What is a teacher? What is the teacher? This led me to ask, because there were a few teachers in school that I occasionally bumped into at this point. If you ever went in for the day, you might see a teacher. And one of them is Richard, who's in this session. And in bumping into him, I said, well, why don't we make some films about what it means to be a teacher? And we did. So we started a kind of nine programs we made together discussing the idea of the teacher. I never would have done this without the COVID experience, but it seemed to me to be what we needed to do. And it reminded me of when I first trained to be a teacher, of the kind of discussion and the ideas that we had. Now, this was a kind of cortex process, as Richard may confirm, and Richard may well disagree with me in a minute as well. But we read the Old Testament, Plato, Aristotle, Socrates, Cicero, Augustine, Anselm, Abelard, and tried to really kind of reposition what it was teachers had done all the way through time. And in a way, what it did, to use the liberal arts terminology, it developed my grammar. I'd also read some other books on teaching by people like Gilbert Hyatt and Richard Weaver, and they showed me that the teacher is not just about methods of learning. For example, Hyatt mentions that the teacher's got to be kind, genuinely kind, not just saying it for the job. Patient, of course, organized. And they reminded me of kind of the fundamentals of what the job it was that I was supposed to be doing. And this, I think, allowed me to come into the second year of lockdown with a bit more focus and energy about what we were trying to do. But we didn't know at this point, this is last September, once the summer ended, that we would then go into a new lockdown in December, Christmas, the one that's just passed, which I think you would have been part of as well in the States. But what I took from Hyatt and Weaver, who said things like this, quote, "The teacher is a definer of words, even seeing the word definer as synonymous with teacher." Now, to me, it's a good, very simple thing, but you don't see it at all in the teaching literature. It's a really old-fashioned thing to say, you define words. He then says, well, the other thing a teacher needs to accept is that one man or woman can know more than another, and then you can teach it. Sounds very, very simple, sounds very stripped back. I suspect it sounds very old-fashioned, but it kind of, it resonated with me when the time came to restart online learning, which came in the January period. So I'm just coming quite close to the end now. The teachers came back in December, or came back to online learning as it was in our second lockdown, with a lot more sense of their own authority. I've heard the word discussed this week of the authority of the teacher quite negatively, but I think it's always there. So I don't think it matters whether you like authority or not. You've got it. The teacher has authority. It's what you do with it, even if you think the students have authority. I believe the teacher's authority is still going to determine essentially what happens. But I put that to you. And Weaver's quote, which I read in his book, really appealed to me. He said that you have to make your mind up whether you're trifling or casual. Quote, either you're going to teach sophistry and etiquette, or you're going to teach names as indexes to essences. You're going to teach facts, a bit like Aristotle said at the start. So when I read this, I felt that the gain for online learning was up. But then I had to return to the core text process that I was actually engaged in. Myself and Richard tried to teach our sixth form students some aspect of core text as what we called a pre-university course. And we decided to focus on aspects of the liberal arts, but we focused on the grammar of core texts. So one of them was the Magna Carta and the US Constitution. And I'll just quote from Magna Carta. Clause 39, no free man shall be seized or imprisoned, or stripped of his rights or possessions, or outlawed or exiled, or deprived of his standing in any other way, nor will we proceed with force against him, or send others to do so, except by the lawful judgment of his equals, or by the law of the land. It's the famous no imprisonment without a fair trial clause, obviously in Latin originally. When I discussed this with the students, I realized that in order to proceed, I needed to and discuss liberty with them, I needed to try to deprive them of their liberty, the liberty that they had taken to make themselves invisible. I discovered that they did not agree with me on this, but that if I did not assert my right to claim visibility, we would find it very difficult to teach. And this didn't work first time, but it did work over time to get them back, if you like, to being visible. And even this week, myself being in London, I have been invisible because it's very, very difficult, I've discovered, to attend everything and be seen at all times, particularly if you're not in the same country in terms of times. But I decided to confront them, and I asked them if they thought that they should be seen. And they did say that they agreed. Now, what we then did with Magna Carta is to say, should they be judged by their peers? This is the famous claim of Magna Carta. And the students, surprisingly, and because most English teachers in England think that the students would never deny the right to be judged by your peers, because they were so influenced by the science of coronavirus and the experts, they said that they thought experts and data would be much better than their peers at deciding guilt. I said to them, why would you not trust your own peers? Who are you? Was essentially a kind of angry response from me. Who the hell do you think you are? You damn students who want experts to judge guilt. And of course, what it means is you accept the power of non-experts to decide if you're guilty. That's the point about jury trial. This led me, coming back to my point and coming right to the end now, to accuse my working class students. And I'm aware that saying I'm going to accuse them of something is not what I've normally hear in England, and it's not what I've heard this week, but again, I put it out there and see what you think. I accuse them of being snobs, which is quite a common thing to say to these working class guys, because they got a hard life and all that stuff. But it forced me to kind of define what I meant by a snob. And I thought, well, can working class students be snobs? I was doing this with Richard in the background. I've got no idea if he agrees with me or not. I'll find out in a minute, I expect. But what happened is that I felt empowered to tell them to stop being so judgmental of other students. They were saying other students would not be able to judge them. And of course, it came to me that this was what was going on because they were not seeing each other either. They'd lost contact with themselves or a sense of themselves as students, as a collective, as peers who could talk to each other properly. And I realized that we had to rebuild this. And that's kind of where I got to by the end of this process. We then went on to discuss the US Constitution and the insurrection led by Trump, the First and the 14th Amendment, which I know you will all be familiar with. But it had a very, very empowering effect on our students because we started to, if I can put it bluntly, accuse them of not demanding enough of themselves. And I found that by taking the students seriously enough to accuse them of not pushing themselves hard enough, they responded. Now, I'm not saying they responded straight away, but I think when we did come back to school, they did start to respond and they could sense the expectation that we had of them as teachers, and that teacher's authority was not designed to disempower them. It was designed to make them better versions of themselves. That's my paper. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. That was excellent. We have things to discuss there.
I look forward to it.
Tim, do you want to go ahead?
Sure. Well, yeah, just to start off with two things. First, Mark, that was interesting. I know coming from Idaho, which is one of the most free American states, especially with all of this stuff, it's really I've understood that Britain has been really quite repressive with these policies. And so, to hear what that's been like for teachers and students there is interesting. But yeah, for us, we were online from March through May of last year. Yeah. And then after that, we were back in person. At my school, masks were not even required in the rooms, and were quickly ditched in the hallways as well. So, it was pretty remarkable to be insulated. I'm very lucky to be insulated from a lot of this. But it sounds like you guys have had to have made hay of it in some ways, of figuring out, going back to what it means to actually teach.
That's a really interesting way of presenting it. Yeah, it's exactly what it was like. Yeah.
So the next thing before I start is to say that I was lumped into this panel at the last minute, and my paper is not about teaching during the online times. It's more prosaic in a way, but it's about, my paper's about one of the greatest books we read at my school, which is Wind in the Willows by Kenneth Grahame. So I think this book has, I think we'll be able to connect at the end a little bit to what Mark was saying, and about what it might help us to learn about teaching in general. But I'll just this is my first conference experience, so forgive my any awkwardness here, but I'm going to probably just read the paper and then stop and explain moments where that seems right. So it's titled Restlessness and Contentment, Happiness and Wind in the Willows. So I kind of want to point out that the book really does have a strange relationship with the Odyssey, which is really strange given that it's totally differentiated in time, space, from that story. So, you think about the Odyssey in general. In the Odyssey, there's this godlike intellect of Odysseus. He's paired up with, he's this Herculean, tremendous strength, would put any of us to shame as modern men. And he leaves behind the one of the greatest victories in warfare, the Trojan War. He leaves behind the chance for, eternally sleeping with goddesses on Mediterranean islands. And it's all just to go home, which is, strange. Homer doesn't, of course, tell us that he continues to journey after he gets home, after he finally makes it home. But poets like Dante and Lord Tennyson have, kind of conspired together to educate our imaginations that that he's the eternal wanderer who keeps traveling even after he abandons chances at immortality, those beautiful Mediterranean beaches, and gets home. He just keeps on going. So I think that there's a conflict at this kind of root work of Western civilization between restlessness and contentment. Do you pursue duty and kind of a contented happiness in fulfilling your homely duties, or do you follow the heart's kind of endless desire for more to attain happiness? What's the better human life? So obviously it's hard for anyone to really wrap their heads around and give an articulate answer to. But at my school, sixth graders who are 11 and 12-year-olds read a children's version of the Odyssey. And so I read Wind in the Willows in my class, which is the year before, so 10 and 11-year-olds, to prepare them for essentially the Odyssey, which may seem odd, but I think it works quite well because in the Wind in the Willows, it's a masterful work of children's literature where the author is able to show this question in a way that kids can understand and articulate themselves. He leads them to it, while also then going even further and leading them to see a potential answer to that question and how they could answer it themselves, which is so nice given, I think one of the things lurking behind what Mark was saying was one problem teachers seem to face is just the collapse of a shared culture or value structure of, how do you even begin to answer questions about what the best human life is? And Wind in the Willows, to us, very boldly tries to do that, tries to just answer that question. So the story begins humbly enough in the dirt. I don't know if you're familiar with it, but we meet at first an unimpressive subterranean creature coming to the end of his rope as he faces the drudgery of spring cleaning. It's very mundane. Fortunately for him, this is the mole, of course. Even he is beholden to things that are great and external. Quote, spring was moving in the air above and in the earth below and around him, penetrating even his dark and lowly little house with its spirit of divine discontent and longing. So already Mole is brought out of his hole, brought out of his mole hole by the force of spring and a divine discontent. It's restlessness that brings him out. He's tired of the same old thing. And this lasts about 3 pages. And within about 3 pages, he comes to a new home. He already settles down again. He meets a friend called the Water Rat. And the Water Rat is best described as, I think, the master of his sharply limited domain, which is his little slice of the river. And he's completely unflappable and friendly. No matter what Mole does, he's endlessly patient and happy to have him around. He kind of adopts the Mole as though he were just an old friend who disappeared for a time, rather than what Mole is, which is a total stranger. And this just happens without any pretense, and the kids accept it. Oh, well, these two just become friends. It's easy. As the Emancipated Mole, as Graham says, Kenneth Graham is the author of the book. As the Emancipated Mole grows under the tutelage of his new friend, he, quote, bent his ear to the reed stems and caught at intervals along the river something of what the wind went whispering so constantly among them. So by the end of the first chapter, Mole's gone from a dark, lonely little home where he knows it's overfamiliar to him to a place of challenge and sunlight and friendship. He's out on the river, this new place. Moles are not great swimmers, and he has to buck up and learn how to cope in that new environment. And so that already introduces you to kids to better and worse forms of life. Do you want to stay in your hole, or do you want to go out into the sunlight and take a risk? But then Graham goes further by teasing them at the end of the chapter, saying, well, Mole is trying to catch the whispers of the wind, trying to figure out what they mean. And I think what that's saying is that the mole is figuring out how to live through a careful attention to nature, which, human nature, right? To paying attention to your own heart, your own interaction with the world will perhaps help you to discover, maybe the only way to begin to discover how you're supposed to live your life. Of the 12 chapters in the book, 8 are directly related to the theme of restlessness and contentment, by title and by content. Most notably, Wayfarers All, Dulce Domum, Sweet Home, and then the last one, of course, is called The Return of Ulysses, and a direct allusion to the Odyssey. Throughout all of these chapters, he doesn't really follow a central plot. He goes through short vignettes, it's more of a thematic book telling this, circling around this question of what is the best human life in regards to the balance between adventure and staying home, between chaos, between order, perhaps. The students are taught to kind of examine the question and then answer the question through a story, right? As compared to something kind of dull, like looking through the premises and conclusions of arguments. This story kind of not only clothes, premises and conclusions in an example, as you might do in a philosophy class or an intro to philosophy class, but it really, it just shows you through a narrative how does that work out? How does it actually work out when a character chooses the path of restlessness over the path of contentment? How does his life turn out? And we see this in a couple of examples. I'll go through 2 major examples. So Mole himself, soon after he makes his ascent out of his hole into the light in springtime, he asks Rat about the whole world, and he's trying to find out, endlessly curious, what's next. Beyond the wild wood, Mole asked. Beyond the wild wood, the Water Rat replied, comes the wide world, and that's something that doesn't matter either to you or me. I've never been there, and I'm never going, nor you either, if you've got any sense at all. Don't ever refer to it again, please. Now then, here's our backwater at last, and where we're going to lunch." And then he just moves on. And so that's obviously pretty comic to adults of the 21st century who are steeped in the idea that you need to explore the wide world, and the wide world is where everything happens. But I've noticed that among my students, the healthiest of them, the healthiest young minds among them, are just intrigued. They're not skeptical of it. I mean, they're intrigued. By that I mean they're curious, but they're not cynical as to say, "Oh, this is silly," because they recognize that this water rat character is actually pretty admirable and noble. He's the master of his domain, and he takes in a stranger and teaches him how to master it as well. So he must mean something by saying that the rest of the world is not worth examining. So soon after this, the mole, in spite of the water rat's advice, tries to conquer the wildwood by himself. And he has a pointless near-death experience brought upon himself by his own idiocy. And he learns that the pursuit of unknown goods is not for him. It says, as he hurried along, eagerly anticipating the moment when Mole was he, when he would be at home again among the things he knew and liked, the mole saw clearly that he was an animal of tilled field and hedgerow. For others, the asperities, the stubborn endurance, or the clash of actual conflict, Mole must be wise, must keep to the pleasant places, which held adventure enough in their way to last a lifetime. Now, it makes Mole sound like he's a coward and weak, especially given the context that he had made this, a silly error of going alone into a dangerous place and then ending up almost dying. But actually, as the story develops, Graham is careful to paint the mole as a increasingly courageous figure. He actually ends up physically fighting in a battle to secure his friend's home against invaders, and is successful. But his courage is entirely contained within his home and with the defense of his home. He never again goes out seeking unknown goods without greater preparation, without greater thought. So Mole's, the other great example of this in the story is Water Rat himself. Mole takes him as a guide, as a sort of older brother figure. And the Water Rat is, consistently presented to us and to Mole as a kind of stable, pleasant, sanguine temperament. He's impassioned only when justice or entertainment are in short supply for his friends. If his friends are bored, or if his friends are in danger by some injustice, then he gets worked up. But otherwise, he's even-keeled. You might criticize his character as a unreflective type, kind of anti-philosophical in a way. He's not, as he says, the wide world is not something anyone, not anyone, not something he or Mole are meant for. I think Graham is careful not to say it's not for anyone. I think he says for Water Rat and Mole, it's not for them. But despite this kind of closed character, Water Rat faces a tremendous temptation himself to go on restless, to follow a restless heart that surfaces. He didn't even know this part of him existed. For the first time in his life, the text says, the Water Rat became restless, and he did not know exactly why. He observes, he's walking along, he sees summer changing to fall. Kind of a period of obviously growth and beauty decaying away. And the narrator Graham reminds us that the rat is a self-sufficing sort of animal who's rooted, but there's something in the air which is unavoidable, and it made it into his very bones. He observes a passel of mice preparing to hole up for the winter. He asks them to hang out with him and keep enjoying the summer, and they say, no, we've got to go. He encounters a flock of birds. They wax lyrically about the passionate, radiant, these are direct quotes from the text, sensuous, song-filled South, in contrast to the oncoming gray lifelessness of winter at home. And so with all of this, with summer changing to fall, these various friends leaving him, he walks along and he realizes that his own loyal heart is at war with a weaker self, so-called weaker self, who dares to daydream of a mythical place called the South, with violet seas, tawny sands, lizard-haunted halls, languorous waters, and purple islands, sounding very much like the land of Odysseus's explorations. This weaker self begins to convince the rat that the unknown, quote, is the only real thing. In a complete inversion of the reality, Water Rat is now coming to view what he doesn't have as the only thing worth having. And at that moment of great weakness and deep disquiet about his chosen life, a stranger appears, and the stranger is nothing like Mole, the stranger he met at first. This stranger is called the Sea Rat, and the Sea Rat is notably the only other rat in the entire story, which immediately casts suspicion upon him. Friendly as ever, though, despite his great self-doubts, our hero, the Water Rat, speaks to him, and the Sea Rat begins to flatter him. He says, "It's a goodly life you lead, friend. No doubt the best in the world, if only you're strong enough to lead it." So he begins to flatter him and then goes on to a monologue, which is in great contrast to the way the Water Rat speaks, which is always blunt, short, clear. Water Rat seems to be, he reminds me of, in America, at least, we have the stereotype of the Little Englander. I don't mean to insult your country, but it's charming, like the idea of someone who really loves their country. They want to, they know what their life is, and they'll defend it. And so for him to say that, and obviously Kenneth Grahame is actually Scottish, but he's writing from across the pond. But Water Rat is simple, he's clear, he's noble. The Sea Rat is deceptive. He speaks in these great speeches that lure the Water Rat, away from all that he knows and loves. The Sea Rat tells him story after story about how he was restless on different Mediterranean islands, how this restlessness in his heart drew him to greater and greater delights as he traveled. So our noble and simple Water Rat then asks him, "Well, do you have stories of battles, great deeds?" Sea Rat shamelessly says, "No, that's not for me. I travel for pleasure, for novelty, and for sensation." Nonetheless, Water Rat is drawn in. Water Rat even says becomes spellbound. The Sea Rat's eyes lit with a brightness that seemed caught from some faraway sea beacon. This compelled his gaze and held him body and soul while he talked. In those eyes shone a hot ruby that seemed the very heart of the South, beating for him who had the courage to respond to its pulsation. The quiet world outside their rays receded far away and ceased to be. So at this point in the story, I've seen students, in their desks kind of tighten up as though a trap were closing around them rather than around the fictional Water Rat, which shows to me that this is effectively demonstrating to them through a story how restlessness and a greedy desire for more experience, ever more out of life, can easily be mistaken for a courage to explore. Water Rat feels that it would be courageous of him to abandon all that he knows and sail the far seas. Sea Rat half invites, then half commands the Water Rat to follow him into the sea as he kind of dissolves in the late summer haze into the distance. And Water Rat begins to follow the apparition. I think it is an apparition. It's only the intervention of his faithful friend Mole that saves him from following this kind of demonic figure. Mole tackles and restrains his friend as he dreamily walks away from all that he's ever known. Mole kind of then nurses him back to life, kind of steadily tricking him into doing some of his old things that he likes to do until Water Rat is happy again. So I think one could write, and I know of such stories, you could write a compelling story about the perils of an overweening love of home. You might extol the virtues that attend the human heart's perpetual desire for greater things. I mean, certainly the Odyssey seems to suggest that, Odysseus's desire for more is a motive force in the story's, power over us, right? His curiosity to continue to explore everything he can to tie himself to the masts so he can still hear the siren song, just so he can know what that's like, shows there's something noble about that curiosity. But nonetheless, Graham's power, and this book's power, is that he very boldly answers the question. He articulates a question of eternal importance to us, which way is best, to follow the inclination of your heart to always seek greater things, to be curious, or to be content with what you have and to be dutiful to your friends and to your home. He's able to lay out this question in a way that children understand, And then he answers it boldly in favor of contentment, in favor of duty, and of defending, of sticking within the limits of your own capacities, and then exercising them to the best you can. So I think the story then prepares them quite well for kind of the greater texts, far greater texts in the Western tradition, especially the Odyssey, of understanding beginning to understand in a more mature way how this is more complicated, and how there is good curiosity and desire for knowledge, desire for the enlargement of one's own capacity over time. And then there is a sort of endless dissatisfaction to life, which attempting to satiate will never suffice. You'll never be able to silence that part of your own heart. So that is the end of my paper. I think, to tie it briefly into what Mark had to say, I think it helps for students to read a book like this. I thankfully read this before we went online. It's kind of complicated for 10-year-olds, even though it is a children's story. But it helped them to see, I think during the online time, we were able to reference it a couple of times and speak about how, they're in this new period of adventure in a way, so much time at home. But they were easily drawn to a great restlessness, obviously, because they felt quite trapped by it. So, trying to give them ways, trying to talk about ways for them to explore their neighborhoods, the outside, in a way that made sense for their age, rather than to lose themselves on the internet or something similarly disastrous for their health and well-being. It was easily tied into this book that we read. So thank you for letting me.
Thank you, Tim.
Yeah.
If I could add to the end of there, the sense of duty that you say Graham argues in the book is a good tie-in for students who find themselves in that new situation of this online environment that we haven't experienced before. I can't speak for you and how your students performed, after they went online, but I hope after reading The Wind in the Willows and having that the importance of that duty discussed in your class, I hope that they were able to make the connection between needing to complete their duties as online students
Right.
in the way they would have in the classroom.
Right.
It's fantastic reading.
Thanks. Yeah. It's that I had never read that as a child.
Yeah.
I wish I had. It's such a great story.
I'd never thought of it in that way till you just did it. It's very good.
Thank you. Yeah. Well, I just noticed it's such a strange book in the sense for them because it has no central plot, and they're very used to stories that are, have a central plot. So to go in vignettes about a theme is a new experience for them altogether.
Well, thank you, Tim. I will. We're running a little bit late. I want to leave more time for questions. I'll try to breeze through my paper here. I am a fourth year PhD student, PhD candidate here at Hillsdale College in our Graduate School of Statesmanship. I am an Americanist. I do most of my research and writing on American constitutional law and related topics. I'm just starting to write my dissertation on Justice Clarence Thomas's jurisprudence in his natural law principles. So you may be wondering why an Americanist is writing about Plato. So excuse me if I butcher this. I'm not a classicist, but we do have some training in Plato here in the graduate school. So I think some of the themes in my paper are going to fit nicely with the questions raised by Mark in his paper. And I want to say at the outset that I wrote this paper and I'm thinking of this in idealistic terms. And I think as we saw in Mark's description of how online education went for him in his school, that might not always mesh with practicality and reality. So to keep that in mind. After Socrates' second speech in the Phaedrus, a discussion about the nature of rhetoric commences. And this culminates in the distinction between the art of writing and the art of dialectic. And that's where we leave off at the end of the dialogue. This passage, I think, provides deep insight into the advantages of synchronous learning, especially for the liberal arts. So in response to the COVID-19 pandemic, many colleges made a rapid shift to online education. And depending on particular circumstances at those colleges, professors had to quickly choose between synchronous and asynchronous learning. So synchronous being the kind of Zoom classroom or the video classroom where there's some level of interaction, and asynchronous being the choice to pre-record lectures or pass out lecture notes as a way to continue the education. And here at Hillsdale College, I think most of our professors chose the synchronous route, but there were a few that chose the asynchronous route, given their particular circumstances. So this paper tries to use the Phaedrus' distinction between writing and dialectic as the basis for understanding the necessity of in-person education, or at the very least, if we find ourselves in a pandemic situation, the necessity of synchronous online education for true liberal learning. So the aggressive push toward utilizing online education methods in response to the pandemic has driven many students, professors, and other researchers to seek justification for the superiority of in-person education over online methods. Some of these arguments have been made with respect to social science, dealing with health and well-being. So the way I came to this topic, or came to be interested in this question, is as part of my research assistantship with the college, I was tasked with evaluating the arguments on both sides of the advantages of in-person versus online. And in reviewing these social science findings, we see significant questions about the health and well-being of students, especially their mental health. And I imagine Mark and Tim, you might be able to speak more to that in a very personal sense with your students, as well as the adverse effects on students from disadvantaged backgrounds in particular. Others have argued from student observations that the loss of community and interpersonal reactions have taken its toll. This applies to the bonds of community students feel with each other, but also the mentorship and guidance they receive in their personal interactions with their teachers and professors. I think John Henry Newman makes this point very well in the sixth discourse of the idea of a university. Newman writes that few indeed there are who can dispense with the stimulus and support of instructors, or will do anything at all if left to themselves. Excuse me. So we lost that sense of community as a result of moving online. However, in searching for a philosophical defense of the merits of in-person over online education, one finds the literature quite lacking, or at least I did in my research. Advances in technology in the 21st century have allowed for rapid, unprecedented growth in distance learning. Prior iterations of distance learning dwarf in comparison to what we've experienced these last few years, especially the last year. There's now a need for a theoretical consideration of the relation between one's physical location and the location of one's teacher and fellow students, and the effect this has on the quality of one's education is now needed as historical matter. The great defenders of the classical and liberal education had no need to make such a defense, for their physical proximity to their students was a given. Think all the way back to Plato's Academy. So I think that it's something we've taken for granted, and now that we're thrust into this pandemic situation, we have to think about teaching in a new way. So in my research, I came across a popular op-ed written by Professor Peter Herman. He's an English literature professor at San Diego State University in California, and he pointed me towards this starting point. In his essay, he considered his students' reaction to the abrupt shift to online learning last spring. Among other interesting insights, he writes, quote, "Ironically, students reaffirmed Plato's criticism of writing over face-to-face discussion. If you ask an inanimate object, in this case, a piece of writing or a painting, a question, Socrates says you don't get an answer. Instead, it goes on telling you just the same thing forever. Ask a video question or a podcast, and you will not get a response. You can't engage it in dialogue. And as Socrates says, it's in dialogue, the teasing out of ideas, challenging them, argument and counter argument, that genuine education happens. So I took that kind of popular rendition from Professor Herman as a starting point for my own dive into the Phaedrus. Although the larger focus of the three speeches in the Phaedrus is on love, the dialogue considers how the art of rhetoric ought to be practiced, which provides Socrates an opportunity to distinguish the art of dialectic from that of rhetoric, and especially notable for our purposes, the art of writing. So within his second speech, Socrates gives the Chariot Allegory, which you might be familiar with. The chariot is the human soul, and the charioteer is the part of the soul which must guide the soul to truth. The chariot is pulled by two horses. In the case of the gods, the horses are very similar, but in the case of human beings like us, the horses are very different. The one horse is noble in character and noble bred. The other is quite the opposite, ignoble and not of noble breeding. It's the task of the charioteer, whom we might call reason, to train its bad horse sufficiently enough to balance the chariot so that it may proceed in the great procession led by Zeus himself up unto the heights of heaven. So how does one learn to use his charioteer in the best and most useful way? I think both of you would know, would answer that's the task of education and the role of the teacher to help the student to learn how to use that. Further along in the dialogue, when Socrates concludes his second speech, Phaedrus concedes that his speech was better than the speech of Lysias, if you're familiar with the dialogue, which Phaedrus recounted at the beginning of the dialogue. This spurs the discussion of rhetoric, and Phaedrus at first thinks that one does not need to know the truth of his subject in order to be an effective orator, but needs only the skills of rhetoric. But Socrates shows him, without discounting the art of rhetoric, that knowledge of the thing is essential to effective oratory, knowledge of the thing itself. Just as the skills of persuasion are necessary to good speech writing, the skills of dialectic are likewise necessary because they are what lead the student to knowledge of the thing about which he is to speak. Socrates even shows how the art of dialectic allows him to make divisions in his speech in order to help him move from its beginning thesis to a fuller understanding, in the case of his speech, of divine love as the greatest of goods. Socrates says that a man must know the truth about all the particular things of which he writes, and he must be able to define everything separately. Then, when he has defined them, he must know how to divide them by classes until further division is impossible. And in the same way, he must understand the nature of the soul, must find out the class of speech adapted to each nature, and must arrange and adorn his discourse accordingly. And these are all things that can be taught to the student of rhetoric and the student of dialectic. The discussion between Socrates and Phaedrus ends with a warning, however, which leads to the most relevant part of the dialogue for our purposes. Socrates warns that the invention of letters and writing, quote, will produce forgetfulness in the minds of those who learn to use it, because they will not practice their memory. Their trust in writing, produced by external characters which are no part of themselves, will discourage the use of their own memory within them. You have invented an elixir not of memory, but of reminding, an elixir of reminding, and you offer your pupils the appearance of wisdom, not true wisdom, for they will read many things without instruction and will therefore seem to know many things when they, for the most part, are ignorant and hard to get along with, since they are not wise, but only appear to be wise. So in Socrates' view, the written word, think of an academic paper or an essay or a book, is only representative of wisdom to the one who's written it. The student needs an interpretive guide to assist and enable him to access that wisdom and make it his own. Socrates writes, or Plato writes, that Socrates says, he who thinks then that he has left behind him any art in writing, and he who receives it in the belief that anything in writing will be clear and certain, would be an utterly simple person, and in truth ignorant, if he thinks that written words are of any use except to remind him remind him who knows about which has been written. And I'm going to quote at length here. I think this is the most relevant to our questions. He says that when he's distinguishing writing from dialectic, he says, writing, Phaedrus, has this strange quality and is very like painting. For the creatures of painting stand like living things. But if one asks them a question, they preserve a solemn silence. And so it is with written words. You might think they spoke as if they had intelligence. But if you question them, wishing to know about their sayings, they always say only one and the same thing. And every word, when once it is written, is bandied about, alike among those who understand and those who have no interest. Reviled, it always needs its father to help it, for it has no power to protect or help itself, end quote. So the father being the writer himself, or in our case, the teacher. So how I ask in the paper, how often does the untrained student pick up a book whose subject is unfamiliar to him, and without proper training in how to engage it, is led astray in deciphering it by his own preconceived notions? If a teacher forced into an online education situation chooses the asynchronous route and records his lecture or sends lecture notes to the students, how often are those students able to engage those notes or that lecture with any degree of precision about the subject being taught if they were not already previously trained? Tim, you can pick up The Wind in the Willows yourself, and sit back on your porch with a beer and open it and have a conversation with Graham about duty and about adventure. But your students aren't able to do that at their age and with their training. So what is Socrates' alternative to this? He writes, or he says in the dialogue, that the word which is written with intelligence in the mind of the learner, which is able to defend itself and knows to whom it should speak and before whom to be silent. And to this, Phaedrus replies, you mean the living and breathing word of him who knows? And Socrates says, yes. He who has knowledge of the just and the good and the beautiful ought not, Socrates says, write them in ink, sewing them through a pen with words which cannot defend themselves by argument and cannot teach the truth effectually. So in this way, what he refers to as the garden of letters is limited as a medium for the one who knows. And the one who knows uses that garden to treasure up reminders for himself when he comes to the forgetfulness of old age, and for others who follow the same path. But it's not in the garden of letters itself that he comes to knowledge and wisdom. Although pursuing knowledge alone is noble indeed, Socrates tells Phaedrus that serious discourse is far nobler, and when one employs this dialectical method, he plants and sows in a fitting soul intelligent words which are able to help themselves and him who planted them. And to the farthest limit of human happiness is the goal of these seeds germinating within the student. One who is well trained in the art of dialectic can perhaps approximate the benefits of learning through conversation on one's own, as I just described with Tim and reading Wind of the Willows himself. You can simulate a conversation in your own mind between yourself and the writer of the book. But for Socrates, this kind of self-study clearly has its limits, especially for the younger student. In the push towards online education as a result of the pandemic, many teachers have unfortunately not taken Socrates' advice that true education in all things true, good, and beautiful requires conversation. These advances in internet technology in recent years have provided convenient and efficient means for the delivery of educational content. However, as you both know, education is much more about much more than just efficiency and content delivery. It's about soul formation. The use of recorded lectures, video demonstrations, podcasts, prepared notes for students to read and engage with on their own time, and other such methods may have their place in introducing a subject, but they cannot replace the organic dialectic, which is an essential characteristic of any good classroom. In instances where in-person education is still not possible due to local ordinances, in order to give students who are on the unfortunate end of a bad deal, which is thrust upon them despite their own will, teachers ought to do everything in their power to find ways of incorporating dialectic into their online courses. And Mark in his paper detailed the struggles with how this works out in practice. And I walked away from your paper sensing the ultimate triumph that you were able to restore some semblance of dialectic with students. The online teacher with students' screens turned off is not better, as you saw in practice, that this kind of teacher is not better than what Socrates condemned in his account of the disadvantages of the written word. In such a case as this, there is certainly no real dialectic occurring, and one wonders how little learning is actually happening. So just in conclusion, if teachers who don't assert the authority that Mark has described if teachers aren't able to assert that kind of authority in order to manage a classroom properly and ensure that learning is actually happening, online education runs the risk of becoming nothing more than what Socrates has told us is a mere elixir of reminding. But if the students haven't learned and engaged with the thing in the first place, this elixir will simply be a waste of everyone's time. Thank you.
Thanks, that was cool.
Let's see, we have about 12 minutes or so. If folks want to ask questions, if I could launch the first question to you, Mark, and you're teaching the Magna Carta, especially in discussing rights of deprivation. Did your students have a sense of being deprived of a right to in-person education? Because that's a conversation we have here at Hillsdale. That's a debate we have here at Hillsdale all the time. And we're obviously at a college level. The students here have might have a deeper sense of what that's worth than a K through 12 kind of student. But did your students have a sense that they were deprived?
That's great question, and another great paper. I love both your papers. Really, really good. I think they did because they came back very quickly whenever we said we're open. We just got so many changes from the government and the school trying to work with the government on what we were proposing to do that we never really had great communication with them. But I definitely think because they came back, there was a sense that they had a right to an education and had been deprived of it. I think my paper was more angled at I didn't want to over theorize their vulnerability, which is quite hard to do. I felt that they were resilient and ready and hungry for knowledge throughout. And it was us that needed to set that example. But definitely I felt there is a problem. They haven't had the education that they would have done, and they're definitely lacking. But I believe we have to sort of fight our way through that.
So, Mark, going after what Chris said in his paper about the obvious superiority of the synchronous learning, where you're actually speaking with the students back and forth. I mean, obviously, a lot of what you had to say was that during your periods of synchronous learning, students tuned out, had their cameras off, and were gone. How did your school? What ages did you teach again, and how did you how much per day did you
11
spend?
to 18.
11 to 18. Wow. Okay.
Yeah, I think we thought we'd made a great offer because we did carry on live online lessons all the way through. We never did any pre-recorded films. There was a lot of in the UK, safeguarding is a huge issue for students, and there was a big concern that if you did a live lesson and you saw what was going on in a student's room, this would compromise the safeguarding of the child and so on. We didn't do that. We decided to try and keep going all the way through, and we made our teachers carry on, and I think that's all the school could do. But I'm not saying it worked. I'm saying that the ethos of the school was right, and I think we were right to do that.
Right.
But I'm not at all sure the actual quality of the lessons that were carried on were good, because in fact the students were not fully present, and that's why I'm saying the final kick, I think, did require the teacher to kind of believe in it.
Right.
And that wasn't clear because everybody was unclear, you know, teacher and student and parent. But we tried. That's true. Yeah.
So in your class, I mean, the school is 11 to 18. What's the dynamic of your
yeah. So sorry, I didn't say that.
Okay.
Sixth form is what Richard is the head of in our school. That's 16 to 18, but the whole school is 11 to 18.
Okay.
The sixth form lessons, which are much smaller, they were probably the most successful all the way through, because you could have a conversation like this. The students felt accountable. The teacher can say, look, there's only 4 of us or 5 of us, up to 15, but most students could be told to turn up and you could make it happen.
Right.
The ones that didn't turn up, we couldn't do much about. With the younger students, in theory, we could do more about, but in practice, we didn't, if they didn't turn up. And if they did turn up, they were often communicating with each other about what they were going to do rather than actually taking part in the lesson. But at the top end, you know, the students that had a very good background at home, ready to learn, they probably carried on as I guess, you know, they did really well.
Right.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Other questions from observers or Mark and Tim? Did anything else strike you in any of the papers?
Yeah. I thought Chris, your identification of this unique requirement to theorize the new dynamic, which we've never had before, is a really interesting take on the situation, because I think I was suggesting it, but I hadn't thought about it in the way you have. We have just assumed that online learning, or what we call blended learning, is just there, or the new normal. And in fact, in the background, there is this kind of requirement to theorize it. And it's very interesting to see if it can succeed. I think the depth of the literature you've gone to refute it, if that's my take on it, shows the richness of the tradition. Fantastic effort. I'm really impressed with it. It's the best response to it I've heard, and I haven't heard it done from the kind of tradition of the texts. And to be honest, same with Tim. The way you're going back to kind of go forward, I find, is exactly what we're trying to do. So I was really, really impressed. It's a session at the end of the week, but it's been really, really good. I'm really impressed with what you've both done.
Tim, can you say more about so in the tension between duty and adventure in Wind in the Willows? Can you say more about what you meant? You said something towards the end when you were talking about your students and the new situation they found themselves in. You were trying to guide them to seek adventure outdoors instead of online. Can you say more about what you mean by that, and what kind of what the experience of those students is?
Yeah, I mean, that was definitely the weakest part of my my little speech, was trying to connect it to in a direct way at the end. But to your question directly, I think, yeah, I mean, we did an hour and 15 minutes a day every school day with our class. We couldn't do more because it was a K-6 school. Many students had siblings. They needed the computer for other classes. They only have one computer, blah, 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 blah. So we would record asynchronous stuff. We would send homework by buses. We would do the hour and 15 minutes a day of actual live class, discussing the asynchronous stuff in the homework, coming back on the bus, whatever. But I was trying to push them to do stuff outside, and asking them about what they did outside, whether they hung out with each other, trying to get them to be as normal as possible, because as it became increasingly obvious this was going to go on for a while, and that it was also becoming increasingly clear that no one in rural Idaho of their age was at all in any danger. The injustice of their situation wore on me, and on them. I think certainly they came back this year, and they're very, by and large, grateful to be back, and will openly tell you that and say, I do not miss online school. That was bad. I mean, because they'll get sucked into YouTube or a video game, and I mean, even by the time you're 10 or 11, even if you're a little younger, you can sense that this is not natural or good for you after a certain period of time. So that they were figuring that out, and I was trying to encourage them to go seek adventure outside with each other whenever possible.
Yeah, Richard.
Yeah, thank you all for your papers. They're really stimulating. I keep on thinking about whether there are things that I really want to savor and save from that experience of the last year. And every time I think about it, I kind of find myself like Chris might have been suggesting, playing sort of technical tricks in my own mind about what might have been good. We did have this really interesting session with another a friend of Mark's and a guest at the ACTC conference, Professor Nigel Tubbs, where we had it was the last week of online learning, and we had an event for the year 12s, the 16, 17-year-olds who are just thinking about university. And we call it Beyond 18, where they get to think about what their future academic life could be like. And we invited Nigel Tubbs from Winchester University, professor in philosophy, to come and talk about what it was to be a professor. And I got my year 12s, which were 71 students, and we invited all of the year 11s who were just about to do some exams, and they're nearly 100 students. But we told the year 11s that if you wanted to come along to this, and we were encouraging them to, it wasn't that voluntary, you had to have your camera on. And the hell that kicked up. They just kicked back. I got emails from kids saying, well, I don't think anyone's going to turn up to your session, sir, because we haven't had cameras on for the last year. And they hadn't. I've been teaching year 11s, and we hadn't pushed it in the lower school. However, in the upper school, we had encouraged it, and 17, 18-year-olds didn't have a problem with it by and large. But, parents were called and arguments were had, and most of them turned up and put their camera on. But it was a really excellent, it was a really excellent discussion. I was just thinking, could we have done that live? Yes, we could have done, and we would have got great questions from the students. But it was a moment of revelation, I think, for both me and Mark, who were sitting at the same screen watching what was going on, because it was the first time in a while that there was this real collective sense that there was a point in talking to each other and seeing each other. And we had a guest to our school who was actually trying to describe what being a professor and being at a university was all about. And the year 11 students were fascinated. And they had been denied some of this stuff in the previous year, but it set us in a good stead for what we want to do with them and get them into our sixth form. But I keep on thinking, any gains from the last year, were they really things that we could have done live anyway? And they probably were. So we hang on to those morsels where we break through a kind of sort of social barrier, and they realize that we're very, very serious and we want them to discuss with people from the outside world. It's not saying that I won't hold on to a few advantages of Zoom and Teams and the rest of it, but I think they were so desperate to come back into the building, and it's lifted everybody. It's lifted the whole staff to get everybody back in the building.
I think maybe one of the things we need to be careful with, we being educators in general at this moment in history, is um, uh, being careful about those. So you're describing your students wanting what they had previously, and desiring that return. I think we need to be careful about the youngest of students, who might, if we allow this kind of online learning to continue in perpetuity, we have to be careful not to allow them to think that that's normal. So there's maybe there's a question there to explore about whether in-person learning is natural, or whether a student can, especially a young student, can be conditioned to think that the online learning is normal. So 10 years from now, if we're still doing this, I wonder if you're still going to have that kind of desire to come back in person. I think we're just about at time here. If anyone has a last question or thought, Reginald.
Yeah, I do. I thought this was a wonderful panel and I enjoyed it. I also live in Idaho. I teach about an hour to the east of Tim in Boise, where I couldn't help but think about, as y'all were talking, about, first off, the role of the teacher. And I think sometimes when we do this great book style education, we put perhaps too much importance or too little importance on the teacher. I think Mark, you're getting at something there, because that tutor guiding us, and as you were bringing up as well, Christopher, is so important. And I couldn't help but think of just a couple quick connections that I made. Living in Boise and frankly being kind of stuck in Boise, I don't have the liberty to leave because of family and so forth. Seeking out education, I found an online program for myself in Great Books that has been fantastic. And we've used Zoom for the last 5 years. We've been using it. And so I think there's an element of the student desire to learn, to want to be there. I rejected hotly that idea of turning cameras off. I just never allowed it. I was just a stick in the mud. I just wouldn't let my students turn their cameras off. And I also note that in a session from yesterday, or maybe the day before, St. John's and Shimer they've both decided recently to keep their online offerings moving into the future, because there's so many people who want to get this style of learning and education. They've realized that St. John's in particular, their graduate institute enrollment has gone up 300%. And that's because of people who self-select to be in. Now, it doesn't solve the problem of people who don't want to be there, which I think many of us may have the luxury of not having to work with. Because I know, Tim, I assume you're at Treasure Valley Classical?
Yeah, you got it.
A lot of support from parents and students who want to be a part. I'm at the public community college, where some of my students, they're on the fence.
Right.
So I think when students self-select this kind of education, I think this medium is great, especially for those at a distance, and it's working really well. But those non-self-selectors are what worries me. And I was curious if Mark in particular had any thoughts on that, because I wasn't clear where your students came from, if they were self-selecting or if it was just geography, if it's a school district, or I don't know.
Yeah, it's just, we get the local population. Yeah. And we were badly hit by COVID, the area was, and it's an East London immigrant, largely community, a lot of Muslim kids, and they are, some are in, some are out, and it's a fight. But generally they want the education. Like you've just been suggesting, I know time's running out. What we did learn is that maybe, when I speak to colleagues like yourselves, and Richard, I'm sure afterwards will say, maybe we could get you to meet our students or some of our staff, because hearing from your kind of accounts is part of the way we've got through this, to keep the broader perspective on things, not just get locked down in our own minds. So I think that is an achievement of the online setup, and that there are some gains, definitely. And most of our students do want to be there, and we're trying to do stuff to reach out as well, which I think is working. So I think there are some things that you can take from this, because it shows that there's life out there, and that education is not just a one-way ticket, and that some people are going to put the effort in to do things differently, and to get those students that really are demanding or wanting something more than the average. Yeah.
And I love Christopher's point on top of yours, Mark, with that, the importance of that dialectic for even in the compulsory classes where students have to be there. I just love that spark we get from those ones who are like, wait, what? This is, we can learn this way. It's truly wonderful. And I think Tim probably gets, and Christopher, a little more of that organically because of your integrated curriculum around it. Whereas I don't think we do at the College of Western Idaho, a public college, and probably not for you and Richard. But thank you so much for all your presentations.
Yeah, thank you. It's a good session.
Thank you. I think we have to end it, but thank you, Mark and Tim, for your wonderful panel papers, and it's a great conversation. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you guys.
Thank you very much.
Sharing it. Thank you. Hey, it's just there we go. So you teach history there? Yeah.
I teach history, and I'm also the chair of our liberal arts program, which I would love to take a lot of satisfaction in, but it's more of a cafeteria plan.